Chapter 2047. Previously, there was an urgent report sent to the Spring Snow Building that there was a Jianghu man who dared to attack the sandbar in the middle of the river at the origin of the crisscrossing tide, trying to cut off the two intersecting tides. Song Li didn't mind that the onlookers couldn't see the tide in the end, but he was surprised by the Machateman's behavior. Now Liang Zhaogo and the Ministry of War had joined hands to suppress Jianghu secretly, and at the same time to gather the forces of Jianghu from all over the place. They were like fishing in a net. The 1,000-year-old tortoises hiding in the deepest part of Jianghu wouldn't be touched, but those fat fish, especially those with nests, only had two paths to take. They could either go to the Ministry of War and file their reports, or wait to face all kinds of unexpected disasters. Now, some of the second and third class sects in Jianghu had been mostly cleaned up, and the next step was to deal with the top 20 behemoths. It was always said that Jianghu was far away, but how far could it be? Now, the hooves of the Liang Iron Cavalry had already trampled on the northern grassland of the old Beimang. Therefore, when Song Li heard that there was someone who dared to commit crimes in his territory at such a critical juncture, Song Li really wanted to see it with his own eyes. Especially when the spy said that the dragon crossing the river was a young woman, he became even more curious. A woman in the world who used a machete to cut off the tide? But the real reason that made Song Li restless was more complicated and deep. He hoped that the audacious female grandmaster from the Jianghu would be able to help him find some clues, and then follow the clues to find a certain person. If that person was still alive in this world, then Song Li would kill him no matter what price he had to pay. In today's Liang Imperial Court, after that person's death, almost everyone felt relieved. The old Beimang officials who had lost their territory because of the defeat felt this way, such as Zhou Xian and Zhou Tan, who had made a comeback, and the civil and military officials of Nanjiang who followed the true dragon to the north, and even the two scholars of Jiangnan and Liao were no exception. This kind of feeling could only be understood but not described. Even though the officials from Beimang were gathered in the capital, as long as they thought that that person was gone and would not appear in the future, they felt that it was not unbearable for the Liang party, which was still in its embryonic form, even if it eventually became the general trend. How could the Central Plains be unfamiliar with the struggle between factions in the imperial court that was always the same? Fighting back and forth, at most they would be spat at in the imperial court, but they would never be stabbed by someone's knife and bleed a few pounds of blood. From now on, the Beiliang Dao was still the Beiliang Dao and the Beiliang Dao was still the Beiliang Dao. However, the Dao of the Su family would stop at the 6th generation of Su Dao, because the Beiliang Palace had become the most magnificent official residence in the world. Song Li knew that person was definitely not dead, even if His Majesty personally said that he was dead. How could the merit of supporting the emperor, and the official who followed the emperor compare to the irreplaceable merit of killing that person? The key was that this irreplaceable merit would not be so great that it would shock the emperor, because His Majesty knew, he knew, and a few important officials who were qualified to come into contact with that level knew. Other than that, no one else knew. Whether or not Song Li, who was destined to be unable to gain merit on the grasslands, could smoothly change the peace character to the conquest character in 10 years depended on this one move. Song Li knew very well that of the 4 conquest generals, other than Wu Zhongshuan who had taken the initiative and kept the title of Southern Conquering General, the Emperor Zhao Zhu, in order to keep the imperial court in check, would definitely have one person from the Liang faction, and one from the Nanjiang faction. Then there was only a literal position left. If Zhao Zhu, in order to appease the old officials of Great Peace City of the previous dynasty, gave out another conquest character, then where would Song Li be in the future? Would he be cooped up in Guangling Dao as a deputy provincial governor for the rest of his life? Moreover, the position of Jidushi in the future would only be a nominal position, and its weight would be far inferior to that of the administrator. Zhao Zhu's new dynasty would definitely not repeat the mistakes of the past and watch as more than 20 Daoist territories reappeared in the world. Song Li did not act rashly and alert the enemy. He ordered the elite cavalry to not move. He only mobilized a large number of secret spies that he had carefully cultivated according to Beiliang's method of raising water and raising eagles, as well as a dozen or so Jianghu dogs with extraordinary martial cultivation. He was going to cast a long line to catch a big fish for the woman whose identity he did not yet know. Zhao Go, who was familiar with all kinds of inside information in northern Liang, had almost died during the auspicious talisman era. Moreover, after the death of Yuan Binshi, the teacher of half-tongued emperor, he completely lost control of the spy network in northern Liang. The successor who took over from Yuan Binshi had always been shrouded in mystery. Even Song Li had no way of knowing the identity of the successor. He only heard that the successor was an old official of the previous dynasty and was almost blindly trusted by the new emperor Zhao Zhu. Song Li did not dare to pry into it because it was a king's reverse scale. How could he not know Zhao Zhu's nature? The true nature of an emperor. What was the relationship between Zhao Zhu and that person? They were true friends of life and death. Otherwise, how could that person have come to Great Peace City alone? How could he have been surrounded by hundreds of Jianghu experts and more than 30,000 armored soldiers? How could he have been seriously injured and died in Wuying Palace? On the bottom line, Zhao Zhu's tolerance was in line with his identity as a wise ruler. Once he crossed the line, Zhao Zhu's iron fist and cold-bloodedness made even Song Li tremble with fear. Back when he had taken Great Peace City, Zhao Zhu had Jiang Fuding and Lin Ye, two martial grandmasters, charge out with only a dozen or so cavalry. Including the main general, the 3 military officers were all sent back with their heads. Even someone as ambitious as Song Li had to admit that Zhao Zhu was the person most suited to be emperor in the world. Even that person was not as good as Zhao Zhu. Song Li gazed into the distance with complicated thoughts. He saw the line of tide surging over like a snow-white wall. The water splashed and shattered like pearls and jade, and the sound was like thunder. It was like the disbanded Bailiang Great Snow Dragon cavalry on the battlefield, and the 10,000 cavalry that had come to Jiangnan in the second year of the Xiangfu years. It was magnificent and could not be any more magnificent. The corner of Song Li's mouth rose as he murmured in a small voice, "Let's go." At this time, among the people watching the tide on the banks of the Guangling River, there was a slender man with a girl with slightly dark skin riding on his neck. She had 2 long and narrow wooden blades, one large and one small, hanging from her waist. Extra Chapter 2. A few days ago I participated in an activity in Longquan and just returned today. Therefore the extra update is slightly delayed. In the future I will try to update regularly around 7 p.m. It will be serialized on the WeChat public platform. Fenghua 1985. Beside the man stood a young girl with skin even darker than the little girl. She carried a sword box on her back, 2 swords at her waist and a long sword at her back. Looking at it this way, the young girl did not look like a swordsman who aspired to reach the peak of the way of the sword, but a girl who wanted to sell swords all over her body. The little girl with her chin on her father's head rubbed his face and chuckled. "Father, you are much more handsome than yourself," the man said softly in a helpless tone. "Heartless daughter." The young girl who carried at least 7 or 8 swords smiled sweetly. The little girl pressed her hands on her father's head. "Oh, surname Su, you are rebelling. See if I don't complain to second mother, third mother, fourth mother, fifth mother, sixth mother, eighth mother and ninth mother. I will say that you are seducing fairies again. Let's see if they believe you or little sweet potato." The man sighed and said, "Little sweet potato, what do you mean by 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th? Besides, this kind of joke must not be made. When I return home, the first thing I will do is kneel on the washboard for 3 days and 3 nights. Won't you feel bad?" The girl nicknamed Little Sweet Gourd folded her hands and looked at the tide. She sighed and said, "Father, I miss our hometown a little. Brother Short Gourd, Uncle Li Yanchao, Grandpa Yen and Grandpa Gu all love Little Sweet Gourd the most. Especially Grandpa, they don't want to see you. They only like Little Sweet Potato." The man smiled and nodded. He did not dare to refute. Little Sweet Potato also sighed and said worriedly, "Father, are we not going back to our hometown anymore? Will Little Sweet Potato never see that big lake again?" Without waiting for the man to answer, the little girl sighed heavily again. "Our family's lake is called Tide Hark Lake. After seeing the tide of Guangling River, I will treat it as if I have returned home." The man smiled and said gently, "You are so sensible." Little Sweet Potato lowered her voice and said, "Then can I go to Wu Wu City with father and not follow Brother Tong and the others home in a hurry?" The man said unhappily, "Sure. At most father will suffer with you. You will be beaten by your mother and father will kneel at the side. We will bear the burden together. How about it?" The little girl weighed the pros and cons, but in the end she gave up. In any case, she could go out with her father every year. She actually missed her mother a little. As for those second mother, third mother, fourth mother and so on, she also missed them. It was just that she did not miss her mother as much. The tide had already passed. The mist that covered the sky and the sun came rushing over. The man did not deliberately block it. The little girl stretched out her hands and made threatening gestures. She was very happy. The man chuckled and said, "Little sweet potato, father often talks to you about that old man in the sheepskin fur coat. Back then your father fought side by side with him here. He broke 2,600 armor with one sword. Don't forget that was one sword in one breath. To be honest, in father's opinion, other than ancestor Lu, I am afraid no one else can do it." Little sweet potato asked curiously, "Even father can't do it?" The man thought for a moment. "His chi is enough, but it is very difficult to use it on a sword. It is far from being as free and easy as that old man in the sheepskin fur coat." "You didn't see that sword?" Little sweet potato waited quietly. The man hesitated for a moment and sighed. "That sword, there is only one sword in the world. Unfortunately, we are destined to never see it again." The man stretched out a hand and pointed to the river. "Even earlier, that old man was probably as young and handsome as your father. He once crossed the river on a sword. He was more immortal than an immortal." Little sweet potato suddenly gave a thumbs up. "Grandpa, you are amazing." Chapter 2048. Of the 3.5 disciples, the other half was the fish dragon gang's young man Wang Dashi. Su Fingyan didn't want to interfere too much with Wang Dashi's life. As for the other three, Yulong's luck was too strong. In fact, there was no need for Su Fingyan to do anything unnecessary. This child was really addicted to being in the border army. In just 5 to 6 years, according to his real military achievements, he really became a lieutenant of the Yuzhou cavalry. The speed of his promotion was astonishing. It was said that when Ko Jianghuai left the northwest border, he also wanted to take this youth to the capital to enjoy life. However, Yu Dilong ignored him and said that he would retire from the army after conquering the entire grassland. He would think about what he would do in the future. Lu Yunzhang's temperament was the most unstable, but he was the most ambitious. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left the Beiliang frontier army and established a sect in Martial Emperor City alone in an attempt to become the second Wang Xianji. As for Wang Sheng, Su Fingyan spent the most effort to cultivate him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken him with him. He wholeheartedly wanted to make Wang Xing into a female Dong Tai. Now that the world's luck had collapsed, most of it rushed into the capital and merged with the new Zhou dynasty's royal family. Therefore, the achievements of the world's martial artists in the next 60 years largely depended on how much luck they could absorb or steal in the next 10 to 20 years. Yu Dilong insisted on staying in the Beiliang frontier army, which was a great opportunity. Because the luck of the Yelu and Murong families on the grassland was flowing to the capital of Liang, Yu Dilong was close to the capital and naturally benefited greatly. Now that most of the qi cultivators in the world had died, especially the great qi cultivators, it was unlikely that anyone would be able to see through the mysteries of heaven and be willing to reveal them. The two of them walked to the place where the horses were tied. Previously, the riverside was crowded with people. There was no lack of half-baked officials and hedonistic sons. This group of people couldn't go to the spring snow building, which was the best place to enjoy the scenery, but they didn't want to go with the flow. Therefore, they temporarily built a rough and sturdy wooden platform. The nearby area naturally formed a place for horses and carriages to gather. Some active businessmen helped people take care of the horses and carriages there. Dozens of wooden stakes were set up by the roadside to tie the horses. In addition, the noble families had groups of strong servants to take care of the carriages, so no one dared to steal the horses. By this time, most of the sons of the noble families had already left. Only a few horses were left tied to the wooden stakes. They couldn't be considered good horses, but this was normal. The world's best horses were all under the buttocks of the border troops galloping on the grassland. The second best horses were also raised in Beiliang's Lianglong pasture and Jizhou's Yulin horse ranch. The second best horses were also raised in the large horse ranches in Beiliang's Lianglong pasture and Jizhou's Yulin horse ranch. When they walked together, Su Fingyan, who was wearing a root-like mask, and Wang Xing, who was carrying a sword and a case on his back, discovered that there was a commotion and a dispute. It turned out that there was a young master who accidentally lost the bamboo tablet that the merchants had previously distributed. When he went back to get his horse, he was temporarily hired by the merchants to make things difficult for him. Originally, if the young man was more sophisticated, it would actually be a small matter to spend a few hundred copper coins. However, in the end he was a young hero who was inexperienced and easily became hot-blooded. He was thin-skinned and suffered a loss. After several rounds of pushing and shoving back and forth, he wanted to draw his saber at the slightest disagreement. The young woman accompanying him, who was the same age as him, couldn't stop him no matter how hard she tried. Her delicate and pretty face was filled with embarrassment, but it couldn't be said that she was frightened or panic-stricken. Those who lived at the bottom of the Jianghu couldn't be compared to those high and mighty immortals who flew here and there to fight. They were neither dragons who crossed the river nor tigers who sat on the ground. They were just small fish and shrimps in a rotten swamp. It was inevitable that they would be covered with the smell of dirt. Therefore they always liked to fight one-on-one. Moreover, it was the kind where the old man led his brothers to fight one-on-one. If the young machete man who couldn't stand being teased decisively drew his saber, it would be fine. Perhaps it could even frighten people. However, for some reason, when the young man drew his saber halfway out of its sheath, it seemed that he remembered some sect rules. In the eyes of those ruffians and wanderers, of course, he was an embroidered pillow with a straw belly. As for the beautiful woman who was implicated, their words became more and more frivolous and obscene. The young machete man who had never been humiliated like this had his eyes bloodshot. It was obvious that he was extremely angry. His whole body was trembling, but the hand that held the saber was still very steady and motionless. When a person has practiced the saber to such a level, even if one doesn't talk about the level of the saber technique or the good or bad moves after drawing the saber, once one has the meaning, it means that one has truly reached a higher level. In the future, one's path of practicing the saber will only become wider and wider. However, if he dared to kill someone here with the current situation of Guangling sect, even if this young man's path was wide, without his head he would not be able to continue walking. When the young machete man saw that the ruffian dared to extend his hand to touch the chest of the woman beside him, he completely exploded. The speed of the saber was so fast that those ruffians who couldn't even be considered half a Jianghu person could not see it clearly. The local ruffian who was scared stiff was dumbstruck. He blinked his eyes and only saw a trace of the saber tip in front of his eyes. His forehead was somewhat cold, perhaps because the tip of the saber had pierced through it. He had the demeanor of a general and did not move at all. Of course, it was not that he really had the courage to be fearless when facing the saber tip, but that his 3 legs were so scared that they were weak and could not move. The young machete man who had almost split the man in half was also somewhat scared. His face was flushed red, and his expression was complicated as he turned his head to look at the person holding the saber with 2 fingers. Su Fengnian's 2 fingers pressed down on the spine of the good saber and he smiled. Young hero, you have to change your temper in the future. When you meet this kind of person who doesn't have eyes and can't be reasoned with, just announce your Jianghu name and sect. It will most likely work. Even if it doesn't work, don't kill people so easily. The government is not to be trifled with. The young machete man took a deep breath and gently pulled out the saber. The uninvited guest with an ordinary appearance also took the opportunity to release his fingers. The young machete man put the saber back into the scabbard and saluted. I have learned. The beautiful and gentle woman smiled at Su Fengnian and said, I am Gao Tengyan of the Spring God Lake's Big Dragon Gang. My father is Gao Biaoyao. May I ask if Senior can come to my humble home for a chat? My father loves to pay respects to the heroes of the world. That's why he has the slightly famous Chivalry Hall. Every time a hero comes, a chair will be placed there. Now there are 26 chairs. Manor Master Tong of Jinswa's Saber Manor has recently received a cordial invitation from my father. He may appear. Senior is willing to go. Su Fengnian interrupted the woman's words and tactfully declined. I won't impose on you. Besides, I'm not famous in Jianghu. How can I be on the same level as that female saber saint in your Chivalry Hall? Master and disciple have urgent matters to attend to, so we'll take our leave first. The woman frowned imperceptibly as if she was wronged and resentful. However, in the depths of her naturally charming eyes, there was a hidden killing intent. She quickly smiled and said, if that's the case, I hope Senior will come visit us when you have the time. Su Fengnian laughed heartily and said, of course, of course. I've long heard that the Big Dragon Gang recently picked up a huge rock from the Spring God Lake. Even the Spring Snow Building can't compare to it. If there's a chance, I'll definitely go. There are more than 100,000 words of extras to read on WeChat's official account. I won't continue to update here. WeChat's official account, Fenghua 1985, Hashtag extras chapter 4x00A0. To read more extras, please follow my WeChat's official account. Fenghua 1985. People who watch the tides year after year will not be satisfied until their hair turns white. From the spring and autumn sword to Yonghui, then to Xiangfu until today's Xianxia, the tides come every year. People with white hair leave every year. Just like the spring and autumn sword and armor Li Chungang in Jianghu, the Su family in the northwest frontier fortress, and the great snow dragon cavalry in the Beiliang frontier army, they will also gradually disappear in the surging river as the old people gradually pass away. Zhou Yi, the prince of Guangling who met a tragic end, once said at the celebratory banquet after the pacification of West Chu that there were only 5 people in his life that he wished to be safe and sound. His old friends on Qingshan, the famous library, and the spring snow building. However, as soon as he finished speaking, the Prince of Yan's horse hooves crossed the Guangling River, and the spring snow building, which Zhao Yi regarded as his exclusive property, became someone else's plaything in the blink of an eye. Su Fengnian glanced at the high spring snow building. Wang Xing asked, "Master, what are you thinking about?" Su Fengnian rubbed his chin, a thoughtful expression on his face. Wang Xing, who are the new top 10 beauties of the Rouge ranking? Wang Xing stamped his feet and said angrily, "Master." Su Fengnian laughed heartily. "Don't worry, your master doesn't have the guts to steal." Wang Xing cautiously glanced at his master, half believing and half doubting. The latter returned a glare, but it did not have much power. The young girl smiled. Su Fengnian looked at this disciple he had picked up on the shores of the Eastern Sea and said softly, "Climbing the path of the sword has always been a process of going from simple to complicated, and then from complicated back to simple. At that checkpoint, if you can endure it, you will be able to gallop across a wide expanse of flat land. If you can't, you can only wander about halfway up the mountain for the rest of your life." Apart from the sword case that old Huang had left behind in Martial Emperor City, Wang Xing also had 9 swords of different sizes hidden in it. They were the thin as a willow branch, moose fish, the dogwood personally forged by the old Northern Han's scholarly sage, Wild Crane, the talisman sword of the great Feng dynasty's loose immortal Huang Sishan, and the short sword, Orb, which the nameless assassin had pierced through the Emperor of Dongyue's abdomen in the early spring and autumn period. Together with the 5 swords, Dragon's Head, 9 Springs, Guizhou, Cloud Mist, and Zhongbing, old Huang's sword case was once again filled with 9 swords. Apart from this, the long sword that hung horizontally behind her waist was the renowned great sword Swallow's Jaw. In the great weapon ranking that was released at the same time as the Rouge ranking, this sword was listed in the 5 spears, 10 sabers, 20 swords, ranking 11th out of the 20 swords and 18th out of the great weapon ranking. As for the twin swords hanging from the young swordswoman's waist, they were treasures of the tide-listening pavilion's armory. Although they were not as good as the Path of Shu that Yu Groom had taken after the battle at the border, and the Path of Shu that had been taken away by him. Chapter 2049. The Fuji that Su Fengnian had given to Ko Jianghuai, who was then the general of Liuzhou, was considered a top-notch weapon in the tide-listening pavilion. White Sword, 100 Refinements, was a homonym of the sword's name. It was quite interesting. All the famous swords in the world were connected and most of them had heavy sword qi. Ever since Wang Xing started practicing the sword, he had been wearing this comical attire, as if he wished he could hang all the famous swords in the world. Even when he had followed White Fox to Beimang to gain experience in the early years, he was no exception. Over time he was able to absorb the sword qi to temper his body and improve his innate constitution. In the end he was able to become naturally connected with the sword. Although Wang Xing wasn't unreasonable, natural sword embryos like Jiang Enai, Qin Tianyuan, or the charcoal girl from the Guanyin sect in the South Sea, he was still a rare genius in the way of the sword. In fact, the girl's constitution, talent, and temperament weren't the best in the world, but none of them were vulgar. This was enough, very enough. Of the 3.5 disciples, the other half was the Fish Dragon Gang's youth, Wang Dashi, who was raised as a free-range boss. Su Fengnian didn't want to interfere too much with Wang Dashi's life. As for the other 3, their luck was too great. In fact, there was no need for Su Fengnian to add more feet to a snake. This child was really addicted to being in the border army. In a short 5 or 6 years he had really managed to become a lieutenant of the Yuzhou cavalry based on his actual military achievements. The speed of his promotion was astonishing. It was said that when Ko Jianghuai left the northwest border, he also wanted to bring the youth to the capital to enjoy life. However, Yu Dilong ignored him and said that he would retire from the army after conquering the entire grassland. He would think about what he would do in the future. Lu Yunzhang's temperament was the most unstable, but his ambition was the greatest. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left the Bailiang frontier army and established a sect in Martial Emperor City alone in an attempt to become the second Wang Xianji. As for Wang Sheng, Su Fingyan put his heart and soul into sculpting him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have brought him along. He wholeheartedly wanted to turn Wang Xing into a female Dong Tai. Now that the world's fate had collapsed, most of it had rushed into the capital and merged with the new Zhao dynasty's royal family. Therefore, the achievements of the world's martial artists in the next 60 years would largely depend on how much fate they could absorb or steal in these 10 or 20 years. Yu Dilong insisted on staying in the Bailiang frontier army. This was a great opportunity. Because the fate of the two major surnames of Yelu and Murong was flowing towards the capital of Liang, Yu Dilong was close to the water and naturally benefited greatly. With such a profound mystery, most of the qi cultivators in the world had died, especially the great qi cultivators. It was unlikely that anyone would be able to see through the mysteries of heaven and be willing to reveal them. The two of them walked towards the place where the horses were tied. Previously, the riverside was crowded with people, and there was no lack of half-baked officials and hedonistic sons of rich parents. This group of people could not go to the spring snow house, which was the best place to enjoy the scenery, nor were they willing to follow the crowd. Therefore they temporarily built a large, rough and sturdy wooden platform. The nearby area naturally formed a place for horses and carriages to gather. There were merchants who were active there to take care of the horses and carriages. Dozens of wooden stakes were set up by the roadside to tie the horses. In addition, the noble families had groups of strong servants to take care of the carriages, so no one dared to steal the horses. By this time, most of the children of the aristocratic families had already left, leaving only a few horses tied to the wooden stakes. They could not be considered good horses, but this was also very normal. The best horses in the world were all under the buttocks of the border troops galloping on the grassland. The second best horses were also raised in Bailiang's Lianglong pasture and Jizhou's Yulin horse ranch. The second best horses were also raised in the large horse ranches in Bailiang's Lianglong pasture and Jizhou's Yulin horse ranch. When they walked together, Su Fingyan, who was wearing a root-like mask, and Wang Xing, who was carrying a sword and a case on his back, discovered that there was a commotion and a dispute. It turned out that there was a young master who had carelessly lost the bamboo tablet that the merchants had previously distributed. When he returned to get his horse, he was temporarily hired by the merchants to make things difficult for him. Originally, if the young man was more sophisticated, it was actually a small matter to spend a few hundred copper coins. However, in the end he was a young hero who was inexperienced and easily became hot-blooded. He was thin-skinned and suffered a loss. After several rounds of pushing and shoving, if there was a disagreement, he would pull out his saber. The young woman accompanying him, who was the same age as him, could not stop him no matter how hard she tried. Her delicate and pretty face was filled with embarrassment, but it was not to say that she was frightened or panic-stricken. Those who lived at the bottom of the Jianghu could not be compared to those high and mighty immortals who flew around to fight. They were not like dragons who crossed the river or tigers who sat on the ground. They were just small fish and shrimps in the mud. It was inevitable that they would be covered with the smell of dirt. Therefore they always liked to fight one-on-one. Moreover, it was the kind where the old man led his brothers to fight one-on-one. If the young machete man, who could not stand being teased, had decisively pulled out his saber, it would have been fine. Perhaps it would have been able to intimidate people. However, for some reason, when the young man pulled out his saber halfway, he seemed to have remembered some sect rules. In the eyes of those ruffians and wanderers, of course, he was like an embroidered pillow with a straw belly. As for the beautiful woman who was implicated, their words became more and more frivolous and obscene. The young machete man, who had never been humiliated like this, had bloodshot eyes. It was obvious that he was extremely angry. His whole body was trembling, but the hand holding the saber did not move at all. It was very stable. When a person has practiced the saber to such a level, even if one does not talk about the level of the saber technique or the good or bad moves, once one has the meaning, it means that one has truly reached a higher level. In the future, on the path of practicing the saber, the path will only become wider and wider. However, if he dared to kill someone here with the current situation of Guangling's sect, no matter how wide this young man's path was, without his head he would not be able to continue walking. When the young machete man saw that the ruffian dared to extend his hand to touch the chest of the woman beside him, he completely exploded. The speed of the saber was so fast that those ruffians who were not even half of the Jianghu people could not see it clearly. The local ruffian who was scared out of his wits was dumbstruck. He blinked his eyes and only saw a sliver of the saber tip in front of his eyes. His forehead was somewhat cold, perhaps because the tip of the saber had pierced through it. He had the demeanor of a general and did not move at all. Of course, it was not that he really had the courage to face the saber tip, but that his 3 legs were so scared that they were weak and could not move. The young machete man who had almost split the man in half was also somewhat scared. His face was flushed red, and his expression was complicated as he turned his head to look at the person holding the saber with 2 fingers. Su Fengnian's 2 fingers pressed down on the spine of the good saber and he smiled. Young hero, you have to change your temper in the future. When you meet this kind of person who does not have eyes and cannot be reasoned with, just announce your Jianghu name and sect. It will most likely work. Even if it does not work, don't kill people so easily. The government is not to be trifled with. The young machete man took a deep breath and gently pulled out the saber. The uninvited guest with an ordinary appearance also took the opportunity to release his fingers. The young machete man put the saber back into the scabbard and saluted. I have learned. The beautiful and gentle woman smiled at Su Fengnian and said, I am Gao Tangyan of the Spring God Lake's Big Dragon Gang. My father is Gao Biaoyao. May I ask if Senior can come to my humble home for a chat? My father loves to pay tribute to the heroes of the world. That is why he has the slightly famous Chivalry Hall. Every hero who comes will have a chair. Now there are 26 chairs. Manor Master Tong of Jinsua Knife Manor has recently received a cordial invitation from my father. He may appear. Senior is willing to go. Su Fengnian interrupted the woman's words and declined. I will not impose on you. Besides, I am a nobody in Jianghu. How can I have the qualifications to sit on the same level as that female saber saint in your chivalry hall? Master and disciple have urgent matters to attend to, so we will take our leave first. The woman frowned imperceptibly as if she was wronged and resentful. However, in the depths of her naturally charming eyes, there was a hidden killing intent. She quickly smiled and said, If that is the case, I hope Senior will come visit us when you have the time. Su Fengnian laughed heartily and said, Of course. I have long heard that the Big Dragon Gang recently fished up a Spring God Lake stone that is as large as a mountain. Even the Spring Snow building cannot compare to it. If I have the chance, I will definitely go. Hashtag extra chapter 5x00A0. To read more updates, please follow my WeChat public account. Fenghua 1985. At that moment she even felt that if she married Song Qiumu today, she would be able to see this female saber saint once or twice every few years. Then her life would be worth it. This was not only because Gao Tangyan was snobbish, but because Tong Shanchuan's current status in Jianghu was too high and too detached. Compared to Taibai sword sex Qin Tianyuan, who wantonly squandered his talent and abandoned himself, Tong Shanchuan's courageous progress on the path of martial arts was particularly eye-catching. It was said that Ko Jianghuai, who entered the capital's Ministry of War as the right assistant minister because of his military achievements, was shocked when he saw her at the border of Ji province. However, this great marriage that should have been passed down as a legend in the imperial court ended without any results. Tong Shanquan indifferently shook his head in the face of Gao Tongyan's almost servile invitation. He said, I appreciate your kindness. Then Tong Shanquan disappeared in a flash. Song Qiumu smiled bitterly. The manor master's unreasonable reply was not surprising. However, after experiencing the local conditions and customs of the Central Plains for the past few years, he could not help but have some doubts. Could Jinsua Saber Manor, which stood out like a crane in a flock of chickens, really have a foothold in the Jianghu of the Central Plains? Gao Tangyan realized that she was not angry at all. She only felt regret. 5 or 6 riders followed the 2 riders from the official road to the north and turned into a small road. After the 2 parties rode for about 2 to 3 miles, the 2 riders turned their horses around and stopped by the roadside. The second-grade consecrator in the lead hesitated for a moment. He told his retainer knights not to follow and went up to the 2 riders alone. Chapter 2050. The old man didn't really care about Gao Tangyan, the daughter of the great Flood Dragon Gang's leader. Of course, he didn't dare to underestimate her either. That young woman's schemes weren't simple. If he mistook her for a gentle-tempered young lady from a respectable family, he reckoned he would suffer a lot. Gao Tangyan's intention was to find a secluded place and use peaceful means before resorting to force. To put it bluntly, she wanted the master and disciple to drink their fill of Guangling River's water. However, the old man wasn't one of those frivolous young men of the Jianghu. He knew that one couldn't see through the depths of the Jianghu with a single glance. That was why he rode up to the two of them alone as a form of goodwill. He looked at the unassuming man with a reserved aura and asked in a deep voice, "May I know where you're from, sir?" Zhou Xian smiled. "I don't belong to any sect." The old man sighed and said regretfully, "Why are you refusing my young lady's goodwill? It'll only take half a day to go and return. It's not a difficult matter. Why do you have to complicate things?" Zhou Xian nodded and explained, "That's true. It's just that I've arranged to meet someone at Mount Longhu. It wouldn't be good to be late." The old man began to feel a little annoyed. This guy who looked no older than 30 was really stubborn. There was a saying in the Jianghu, "The emperor on the river, the monarch in the lake, the retired emperor on the mountaintop." Don't tell me you're going to meet that retired emperor? Otherwise, don't tell me my great Flood Dragon Gang's leader, Gao Biaoyao, isn't worth half a day of your time? At that moment, the old consecrated of the great Flood Dragon Gang heard that guy say with a smile, "Draw your sword." The young woman turned her head and followed her master's gaze. She asked seriously, "Master, how much strength do you have?" Zhou Xian was so angry that he laughed. 12 points. The young woman grunted. She pressed her hands on the hilts of the two swords at her waist and twisted her waist. Her figure instantly left the horse's back. The sword hadn't even left its scabbard, but the cold sword chi was already rushing toward the old man's face. The old consecrated of the great Flood Dragon Gang, who boasted that his martial cultivation was rarely matched in a province, was instantly terrified. His mount, too, was so frightened that it raised its hooves. Fortunately, the hidden girl didn't target him, but instead quickly moved to the other side of the road. The girl held a sword in each hand and two snow-white streaks of gang chi shot out from her sword, fierce and unparalleled. One after the other, they slashed at the woman with the saber who had landed on the other side of the road. The latter dodged to the side, one hand on the saber hilt, but there was no sign of her pulling it out. She quickly retreated with small steps. After the young girl, whose two sword auras missed, landed on the ground, she followed like a shadow. Her body spun rapidly and two dazzling arc-shaped sword auras, one high and one low, swept towards the woman. The latter abruptly sank her chi into her dantian and leaned back, barely dodging the two sharp sword auras that slit her neck and waist respectively. When the young girl charged forward with a straight thrust of her sword. At that moment, the saber-wielding woman, who had yet to straighten her back, lightly tapped the tip of the long scabbard at her waist on the ground. A powerful aura burst forth, and the young girl, who seemed to have sensed that she was no match for her, made an inconceivable move. Her right hand's fingers released the sword that had stabbed forward, and she quietly twisted the wrist of her left hand that was holding the 100 refinements. Both swords left her hands. At the same time, the young girl stopped and took a step back. Her aura also rose rapidly. Her right hand circled behind her back and grabbed the famous swallow's jaw that hung horizontally behind her waist. The saber-wielding woman, who had not attacked from beginning to end, disappeared. Of the two long swords that had left the young girl's hands, one was slanted downward and the hilt was raised high. The tip of the white sword was pointed straight at the woman's chest before she disappeared. As for the 100 refinements in her left hand, which had suddenly disappeared and then suddenly reappeared, it hovered at the spot where the saber-wielding woman had originally retreated. The young girl drew her sword from its scabbard. This time she held the swallow's jaw in her hand, but compared to when she held the two swords with both hands, her aura was even more astonishing. Sword aura surrounded her, and her sleeves were filled with a sharp glint. In the next moment, a blinding light burst forth. The sweaty Great Flood Dragon Gang honorary elder only saw the young girl holding the swords with both hands. The two long swords that had been hovering in the air earlier seemed to have been ejected. They spun a few times in the air before they were nailed to the ground on the path. When the young girl swung her sword down, The saber-wielding woman only raised her saber to block, and she blocked the young swordswoman's 3 strikes. The old honorary elder did not see the mysterious scene at the last moment at all. The red sandalwood sword box on the young girl's back trembled slightly, but her master said, "That's enough." After the young girl heard her master, she put away the swallow's jaw and went around to put it back into the scabbard. The 2 swords on the ground flew back into the scabbard at her waist on their own. Everything was done in one breath, showing the demeanor of a grandmaster. The young girl returned to her horse's back. Her head was lowered and her expression was gloomy. Wang Xing was very angry at herself for not being able to make the young saber-wielding woman use her 3 strikes with all her strength. Although she still had 9 swords in her scabbard, she knew very well that even if she used all 12, she still had no chance of winning. At most, the moment her opponent unsheathed her second saber, victory and defeat would be decided. Other than the young girl's second master, this was the most powerful saber-wielding person she had ever seen in her life. Su Fengnian comforted her. "You're already very good to be able to take a heavenly treasure from this manor Lord Tong's waist and hold the scabbard with your left hand." Wang Xing lowered her head and did not speak. Su Fengnian glanced at the female grandmaster standing quietly in the distance. He smiled and did not greet her. Then he rode away with his depressed young disciple. Tong Shanquan sighed softly and left without a trace. Only the pitiful old consecrator swallowed his saliva. The sword energy were so damn dazzling. Was it because they did not need to spend money? They even had the legendary sword control technique. That young girl who looked no more than 15 or 16 years old, had she been practicing swordsmanship since she was in her mother's womb? Then who was that young woman with 2 sabers? Could she be Manor Lord Tong, who ranked 11th in the world? The world was so big. Could he really meet such a grandmaster who was like an immortal? The 2 rode side by side. The young girl suddenly raised her head and asked, "Master, am I very useless?" Su Fengnian did not answer the question. All the masters in the world hope that their disciples can surpass their masters. However, if that day really comes, they will definitely feel sad. Anyway, I just hope that day will come. It's just a few days later. It doesn't matter. The young girl smiled through her tears and did not say anything. Su Fengnian did not deliberately explain the identity of the woman with the sabers. In the current Jianghu, he Su Yambing Luo Yang Dong Tai Huyen Daguan Li Dongxin Chen Jibao Gu Jiantang Tuoba Bodhisattva, and Tantai Pingjing had either died or been crippled in the past few years. They had all disappeared without a trace. So many grandmasters had naturally surpassed them. After the battle outside Jebei City, Xianyuan Qingfeng had finally stepped into the diviner realm with both feet. He had become a worthy immortal and vaguely the new number 1 in the world. However, before the martial arts evaluation, Xianyuan Qingfeng had publicly announced that if she was chosen to enter the rankings, she would teach those behind the scenes a lesson. Therefore, the evaluation this time did not clearly state who was the number 1 in the world. It was similar to how Wang Xinji had claimed to be the number 2 in the world. However, this made it even more amusing. Instead of the number 1 in the world, Xianyuan Qingfeng had become the number 1 in the world. In addition, this was the first time a woman had reached the top of the martial arts evaluation. The shock to Jianghu was even greater than when Xianyuan Qingfeng had become the leader of Jianghu in the early years. The number 2 in the new martial arts evaluation was Yu Groom, followed by the female sword immortal, Cui Hua of the Wu family's sword tomb. The next 7 people were Jiang Fuding, Qi Xianxia, Mi Fingjia, Huang Fangfuo, Li Hozhao, Zhu Huang and Linya. Tong Shanquan of Jinsua's Saber Manor was right behind these 10 people. Among the 20 people, there were only 4 grandmasters in the old Beimang, and they were all behind Tong Shanquan. It was extremely pitiful. Fortunately, among the 10 new grandmasters, 7 of them came from the Beimang grassland. For example, Bai Yusha of the Chess and Sword Music School, who was known as Calm Storm, and the wanderer Tai Mu Dai, were well known in Jianghu. When Su Fengnian rose to power, it was undoubtedly the peak period of Jianghu. However, Jianghu was not the same as a farm. After the small new year, there was still a big new year. The sun stopped at the West Mountain and the sunset glow was dazzling. That scene gave people a very magnificent feeling. At that time, including the saints of the 3 sects, there were close to 10 land immortals living in the world. However, like the final radiance of an old man past his prime, the sun set and did not rise again. The new Jianghu welcomed the scene of a bright moon in the sky. After that, it would be a small year where the harvest would decrease. After Udilong and Go Yufeng, the land immortals would become extinct. Then it would be the celestial realm, and then the mysterious realm would become the land immortals of that generation. In the end, there would be no more rank 1 experts in Jianghu. Su Fengnian sighed softly and turned his head to look at the young girl who was covered in swords. He muttered to himself, in the future, as long as there is someone who can use a sword to spit out more than an inch of sword light, they will be a shocking sword immortal. Hashtag extra chapter 6x00A0. To read more updates, please follow my WeChat public account. Fenghua 1985. The full moon hung in the sky. It was like a jade plate hanging above the heads of the human world. The moonlight was like water. A group of more than 100 cavalrymen wearing exquisite armor turned from the official road to the small road. The strong horse hooves seemed to crush the moonlight on the muddy road. The cavalrymen were all equipped with swords and crossbows. They were abnormally strong. The burly cavalryman was actually holding a long spear. Under the moonlight, the man's hideous scar that stretched across his entire face could be clearly seen. Horse lances rarely appeared on the battlefield after the spring and autumn period. This kind of weapon had been the specialty of the generals of the border army since the Great Feng dynasty. First, it was not easy to make and was expensive. It was as rare as the Fergana horse. Second, it was inconvenient to use. It had to be used for at least 10 years before its power could be seen. Therefore, people who were not from the border families would not bring it to the battlefield. Since this cavalryman had a long spear, he was obviously not an ordinary cavalryman. He must be from a prominent family. Chapter 2051. A scout turned back from the small path and reported loudly, "General, the Su family's thieves still have a dozen or so Jianghu bandits escorting them. They will be easily intercepted by our brothers who are waiting at the front." The horseman sneered, "Good. These reckless Jianghu scum dared to collude with the remnants of the Su family and killed more than 30 of our brothers. Tonight I will serve these bastards well." About a mile away from this elite horseman, on a small path that could only allow 3 riders to pass side by side, 12 or 13 people were escorting a horse carriage. When they saw the bright light in front of them, their faces changed drastically. They saw torches raised at the end of the path with 3 riders in each row. There were more than 10 rows in total. Under the light of the torches, the elite horsemen held the standard light crossbows of the Liang military ready to fire. When these righteous Jianghu bandits saw this scene, although they had already disregarded their lives, they were still frightened. Previously, to rescue the Su family of Guanhai County who had been loyal to them for generations, they left the mansion secretly and left the city through the city gate. They were all scared but not in danger. They didn't expect that not long after they left the city, there would be more than 100 riders charging towards them. 7 or 8 of them died under the light crossbows. If it wasn't for the Master Jianghu Sr. who had the cultivation of Master Realm, who took the initiative to cover their retreat and retreated with his own strength, no one would have been able to escape 30 miles away. Some of them looked back and saw that after the senior killed more than 20 riders, he was hit by several arrows. Then he was stabbed in the chest by a rider with a strange spear. Using the huge inertia of the horse's charge, the master was pushed back more than 40 steps. In the end, the rider casually threw the corpse a few feet away. It was obvious that the rider's innate strength and martial cultivation were both amazing. Even if a level 2 Master Realm Master wasn't injured, he would probably be on par with the rider. A Jianghu rider glanced at the large paddy fields by the side of the road. Most of them had finished their autumn harvest. Bunches of straw that had been harvested were piled up on the fields. They didn't have time to pick them up and bring them home. He turned around and roared, "Get into the fields." The old coachman who was driving the carriage gritted his teeth and abruptly reined in the horse, turning around and following the slope towards the dried-up paddy field. The carriage was not as light as a horse, so it immediately jolted violently. After passing through a short but hard ridge, it rushed past. The 4 wheels momentarily stopped in the air before crashing to the ground with a loud bang. A series of painful cries came from within the carriage. There were men and women, and judging from their voices, they were all very young and even had a hint of childishness. The elite cavalry that was in charge of intercepting the carriages had mocking looks on their faces. Did these fellows really think that they were the Beiliang Frontier Army and the Beimang Cavalry? On the battlefield, Did they think that such a blunt turn of events could be played so easily? More than 40 light cavalry similarly descended the slope and entered the fields. However, compared to the panicked fleeing group, this cavalry, who were familiar with archery and horses, was not only calm and unruffled, but also had the demeanor of an autumn hunt. No wonder these cavalrymen were so conceited, it was because they were worthy of this arrogance. They were once part of the cavalry that crossed the Guangling River to the north of the southern Xinjiang army. Although the fighting on the battlefields in the capital could not be considered tragic, since they were able to become part of the southern Xinjiang cavalry in the early years and were even seconded to His Royal Highness, the current emperor, for a period of time to serve Zhou, they naturally could be called first-class elite soldiers. However, at the crucial moment of merit and reward, the commanding general, Gao Bohai, who commanded 8,000 cavalrymen, for some reason had a dirty relationship with Che Yi, a former direct subordinate of King of Shu, Qin Jibao. Originally, they thought it was a trivial matter and would not delay the conferment of Marquis and General. Unexpectedly, His Majesty the Emperor was enraged over such a trivial matter. Even though Gao Bohai had Zhang Dingyuan and Gu Ying interceding for him, he was still directly removed from his post. The 8,000 cavalrymen under his command were split into 3 groups. One group of 2,000 cavalrymen remained in Guangling Road and temporarily belonged to the general's mansion of Jianzhou. The cavalry general of this group, Gao Tingho, was the only son of the original commander-in-chief, Gao Bohai. Guanhai County was not eye-catching in the old West Chu territory where half of the scholars in the world came from Guangling. The county did not show a luxuriant scene of well-dressed Chinese people standing shoulder to shoulder. Instead, it was the Guanhai Su family that stood out. The Su family was worthy of being called the De Chu's literary courage for generations. Their family's history could be traced back to the Ganlu Southbound at the end of the Great Feng dynasty. They were an important branch of the top tycoon in Great Feng dynasty Huangdang Su family. Later on, the Guanhai Su family assisted the Xianxia family of Dechu for generations. They were good at governance and were once praised by the Xianxia emperor as Dechu's literary courage. However, when Jiang Si and Chao Chongqing joined forces to restore the country, the Guanhai Su family might not be optimistic about West Chu's restoration. It was also possible that they were scared out of their wits by the billowing smoke of the destruction of Dechu and managed to escape the disaster. However, the Guanhai Su family's talents withered and the family's decline could not be salvaged. The eldest grandson of the Guanhai Su family, who had high hopes for the family, participated in the imperial examination together with Song Maolin. However, the latter won first place in one fell swoop and added flowers to the brocade of the Song family's prosperity. On the other hand, the former did not even qualify for the palace examination and failed early in the autumn imperial examination. It was destined that he would not be able to help the family in their hour of need and could only stake everything on one throw to stay in the capital and wait for the next examination. Originally, the Guanhai Su family's fate would only rise and fall in the Jiangnan scholarly circles or the future new Liang officialdom. However, because of the Rouge Review, God played a big joke on the Su family, who was the most fragrant of Guangling's Daoist books. A concubine's daughter who was originally raised in a boudoir and was unknown to everyone became a part of the Rouge Review at the age of 15. In one night, the world knew that the comment, "The Su family's daughter's beauty is enough to make the carp in the lake jump to the shore." Her name shook the north and south of the river and she was ranked 4th in the Rouge Review. In an instant, the number of people who wanted to marry her almost broke through the doorstep. People from all walks of life came one after another. Although the Guanhai Su family was focused on learning, they still maintained the strength of a scholar when faced with people who were caught off guard. They said that the woman in the family had already set up a matchmaker many years ago and that the marriage would be completed when the man turned 20. The Guanhai Su family would not go back on their word. However, no one would have thought that the Su family would grit their teeth and persevere, but the aristocratic family of Guanhai Commandery, who had been friends with the Su family for a long time, would shrink back and resolutely deny the marriage. The young man, who was only half a year away from becoming an adult, quickly got married under the urging of his father. He married a pretty girl from a small family of equal social status. All of this was, of course, caused by Deputy Provincial Commander Song, who had smelled the scent of blood. Think about it, how could Song Li miss a Rouge Review that was within his jurisdiction? Tonight's bloody interception was only Marquis Gao Tinghui's pledge of allegiance. However, Marquis Gao Tinghui did not expect that to deal with a group of scholars, he would lose 30 elite cavalry who were completely capable of making a name for themselves at the border. After all, he had underestimated the power of the Central Plains aristocratic families. The dozen or so Jianghu heroes surrounding the carriage all saw something strange in the distance. In the distant field, behind a pile of rice, there were two people, one big and one small, lighting a bonfire as if they were roasting game. At this time, the elite cavalry who had caught up with the carriage team had already raised their crossbows and shot out arrows. The unique sound of the arrows piercing through the air was particularly ear-piercing in the silent field. One was in the south and one was in the north. The distance between the two sides was less than 30 steps. Most of the heroes who knew martial arts were able to use their weapons to block the arrows. However, there were still two people who were unlucky. They dodged the first arrow but did not dodge the second arrow. One of the riders was shot through the throat. He staggered forward for a dozen steps before falling off his horse and dying. The other rider was directly nailed to the temple. The huge penetrating force caused the rider's corpse to fall out on the spot. When the carriage brushed past the bonfire, another two Jianghu heroes who had stood up for the Su family out of righteous indignation died on the spot. Probably because the two sides were about to leave Tian'an and enter the dense forest in front of them, the light crossbows in the hands of the elite cavalry began to deliberately shoot at the horses of these people. The two large horses of the carriage were especially targeted. When the horse to the north was hit by 3 arrows, although the elite cavalry was afraid of accidentally injuring the prey in the carriage, the arrows that were shot at the horse were not fatal. However, it was enough to stop the carriage. The old coachman's face was filled with despair as he tightened the reins. Ignoring the pain in his arm, he forcefully stopped the horse to prevent the carriage from flipping over. The remaining Jianghu riders all stopped their horses to the north of the carriage and formed a line, protecting the carriage behind them. Keeping a promise was worth 1,000 gold and disregarding life and death. This was the foundation of these Jianghu people. Although the word loyalty was becoming less and less valuable in the new Jianghu, at least these people still firmly believed in the rules of the older generation of Jianghu. A middle-aged man who looked like a military officer leisurely turned his horse. After circling around the same place, he pointed the tip of his sword at the carriage and said in a deep voice, "Everyone get off." No one responded. The knight sneered and waved his sword forward. Another wave of light crossbows shot out. There were only 8 Jianghu people left. Half of them used their weapons to deflect the arrows or bowed their heads to avoid the arrows. The other 4 charged forward and without exception, they were all shot by the arrows and became like hedgehogs. An arrow accidentally hit the carriage and made a bang sound. The military officer did not even look at the corpses and said sternly, "I'll give you one last chance." An even more hurried and muffled sound of horse hooves sounded in the distance. The main general, Gao Tingho, had already led the 100 cavalry over. When he passed by the bonfire, he did not brazenly kill. Instead, he used his lance to poke and flick the bonfire. Suddenly, sparks flew everywhere and trapped the 2 pitiful people who were sleeping in the countryside. He slowed down the speed of his horse because he found that the 2 people who should have been in a panic were still sitting in the same place and did not roll or crawl to avoid the sparks. Gao Tingho hesitated for a moment but did not stop his horse. After all, the prey tonight was related to his career and he knew what was important. Chapter 2052. Due to Marquis Gao Tinghao's mercy, the hundreds of elite cavalry behind him didn't kill them. However, a few of them shot a few arrows and nailed them into the ground beside the 2 men. The closest arrow was only 3 or 4 inches away from the feet of the man in the green robe. Marquis Gao Tingho approached the carriage and looked at the 4 Jianghu heroes with a gloomy smile. "You 4, get off your horses and don't die. You've already done your duty by escorting them all the way here." The 4 men looked at each other and 3 of them slowly got off their horses with shame. Marquis Gao Tingho tilted his head and arrows rained down on them. The 3 men's thighs were hit by several arrows and they fell to the ground crying out in pain. Marquis Gao Tingho raised his lance and pointed at the only young man who didn't get off his horse. He smiled and said, "Tell me your name." "I don't kill nameless people." The young man put his sword back into its sheath and said, "Hezhou's great sword hall's disciple Lu Guanshan." Marquis Gao Tingho raised his eyebrows. "What's your relationship with the great sword hall's hallmaster He Xuewu?" The young swordsman with an elegant temperament replied, "He's my teacher." Marquis Gao Tingho couldn't help but frown. Not only was he Shuawu a tiger in Hezhou's Jianghu, but more importantly he had stopped West Chu's Chao Chongqing from entering Great Peace City. In the end he even received a copper fish bag from the Ministry of Justice. Back then when the emperor led the army to the north, many of the Great Sword Hall's disciples joined the army. This was a problem, but it was just a small problem. Marquis Gao Tinghao's mouth twitched. I heard that your teacher is expected to become a rank 1 martial master in the next few years. Then go and tell He Shu when he breaks through. I'll definitely pay him a visit and fight to the death with your teacher. We'll see if your Great Sword Hall's sword is bigger or my Gao family's lance is longer. The young swordsman was stunned and didn't know how to respond. Marquis Gao Tingho raised his voice. Su family's disciples, if you have any backbone, get out here. #### extra chapter 7x00A0. To read more updates, please follow my WeChat account, Fenghua 1985. Even though the old coachman tried his best to stop them, there were still disciples of the Su family coming out of the carriage. 1 boy and 3 girls. The boy was only 15 or 16 years old. The oldest was a middle-aged woman. The oldest girl of them all. The oldest girl was a middle-aged woman. Ants. And turned and gently placed to the middle-aged woman to the woman. Ants. The woman felt a chill on her slender shoulders. Her face turned pale and her body trembled. She hugged the child in her arms tightly and summoned her courage to raise her head and say, General must be familiar with the art of war and have heard of the strategy of luring the tiger away from the mountain. Tingho T.A. And the horse lance thrust out like lightning, and heavily struck the delicate and pretty boy's arm. The boy collapsed to the ground and stretched out his hand to cover his wound. He was in so much pain that he rolled on the ground and cried out in heart-wrenching pain. Marquis Gao Tingho closed his eyes and sorted out tonight's deployment in his mind. There shouldn't be any mistakes. He opened his eyes and pointed his lance at the girl in the woman's arms. He said expressionlessly, I advise you to tell the truth. It's not a good thing for a beautiful woman like you to be alone in the wilderness. Even if you don't care about your chastity, you don't have to cherish the few remaining students of the Su family. But how old is the girl in your arms? The maid wanted to step forward, but the middle-aged woman held her arm tightly. The middle-aged woman smiled bitterly and said, The Su family of Guanhai, regardless of gender, old or young, will never disgrace the Su family. Marquis Gao Tinghao's eyes were sharp. He glanced at the middle-aged woman's hand and laughed, So that's how it is. Insignificant skill. Marquis Gao Tingho stopped laughing and sneered, The Su family's style? Now that the Su family of the Northwest is gone, how can your little Guanhai Su family be worthy of the word, style? Marquis Gao Tingho pointed his lance at the big sword hall disciple not far away and said with a playful expression, You are a smart person. I suddenly have a desire to cherish talents. One day after I kill your master, you will be the hall master of the big sword hall. How about it? Lu Guanshan's expression was uncertain. Marquis Gao Tingho clicked his tongue and said, The situation has already been decided. What's the point of caring about face? That's not smart. At this moment a voice sounded from behind them, Sister-in-law, you are also surnamed Su. What a coincidence. We were family 500 years ago. Marquis Gao Tingho turned his head and looked with a face full of hostility. He saw 2 passers-by, one big and one small, roasting game in the field. Before Marquis Gao Tingho gave an order, there was the sound of blades being drawn. Then an unbelievable scene appeared. One big and one small walked through the gaps between the horses like they were taking a stroll. They casually bent their backs and lowered their heads as they moved. No matter how the blades of the elite soldiers slashed at them, they were able to dodge them. The 2 of them passed through the encirclement of the cavalry just like that and were only 10 steps away from Marquis Gao Tingho and his horse. Marquis Gao Tingho held the lance tightly and laughed coldly. So they were really strong Master Realm experts. The green-shirt male looked like he was in his 30s. He had a gentle aura and his clothes were clean and tidy. He didn't have the arrogance of an official's son and instead looked like a good-tempered private school teacher. Behind him was a young female swordsman with a sword on her back. At this moment 2 silhouettes arrived, their auras were like rainbows. One of them carried a sword on his back, and there was a faint hum of a sword in his scabbard. The 2 stood side by side at the ruins of the carriage. It was a man and a woman. Both of them were quite young. The woman was wearing a purple dress and the man carrying a sword was about 20 years old. His face was like jade and his scabbard was trembling slightly, and the sword was humming non-stop. Marquis Gao Tinghao's heart shook. Compared to the green-shirt male and female swordsmen who hid their strength, this young swordsman who could already form a connection with the sword was even more troublesome. Even if this sword path genius of unknown origin hadn't reached grade 2, once a swordsman resonated with the sword, he couldn't be judged by common sense. Lu Guanshan of the Great Sword Hall, not to mention his current combat strength in terms of martial arts, even 10 of him added together couldn't compare to this person. The swordsman didn't care about Marquis Gao Tingho and said respectfully to the woman, "I am Lu Sichu. I was asked by Brother Lu to escort you to the capital." Marquis Gao Tingho suddenly understood. No wonder he was the grandson of the former #1 swordsman of Dechu, Lu Dantian. No wonder he had such shocking attainments in the way of the sword. The purple-shirt female with good cultivation pressed one hand on the hilt of the sword at her waist and the other hand gently shook the exquisite jade pendant at her waist. She smiled and said, "Oh, are you chasing after a fugitive or what? How come I didn't hear from Uncle that there are still remnants of West Chu and Guangling Path?" Marquis Gao Tingho, who had everything going wrong tonight, held back his anger and asked with a smile, "Miss, does your uncle's words have any effect?" She widened her eyes and pretended to be naive. "Ah? Even the words of a provincial governor don't have any effect?" Marquis Gao Tingho asked, "May I ask what is your relationship with Master Su?" The woman tilted her head and answered playfully, "Guess." Marquis Gao Tingho laughed and then raised his arm and said in a low voice, "Retreat." 150 elite cavalry galloped away. As for whether they would return with 1,500 cavalry, that would depend on whether Marquis Gao Tingho dared to take a gamble. Without needing the woman from the Guanhai Su family to remind her, Lu Sichu strode forward and crouched down. She helped the young man who had fainted from the pain by pressing his acupoints to stop the bleeding, applying medicine and bandaging his wounds. After picking up the young man said without hesitation, "We have to leave this place on horseback. We can't care about the corpses of these chivalrous men. Let's pick out uninjured horses. If there are people who don't know how to ride, let's ride with them. We have to at least reach the border of Hezhou to be safe. But the problem is that before we leave Jianzhou, that guy called Marquis Gao Tingho has 2 accomplices who happen to be in charge of border military affairs. It's very troublesome." Lu Guanshan, the personal disciple of He Xiaowu of the Big Sword Hall, sighed. "As long as we reach Hezhou, I can mobilize some of the Big Sword Hall's power and do my best to cover for us." Lu Guanshan suddenly asked, "Miss, didn't you say that you and our provincial governor of Guangling Path, Master Su?" The purple-shirt woman rolled her eyes and said, "You really believed it?" Lu Guanshan smiled awkwardly. LV Sichu whistled and 2 horses galloped out of the forest. He and the purple-shirt woman rode 1 horse each. The loyal old coachman of the Su family naturally knew how to ride a horse. Including Lu Guanshan, there were 4 people who could ride a horse. The young man from the Su family, the woman, the little girl, and the servant girl also happened to be 4 people who did not know how to ride a horse. However, it was a little troublesome to divide them. The problem was that the woman and the servant girl were from different families, so it was naturally inconvenient for them to ride a horse with the men. Logically speaking, the woman who was of a higher status should sit behind the purple-shirt woman, but the woman sent the plain-looking servant girl to find the purple-shirt woman. She handed over her tear-stained daughter to LV Sichu, while her face was flushed with shame and anger. Just as she looked at Lu Guanshan and was about to speak, the green-robed man who had been ignored by them all this time slowly said, "If you insist on heading north, you definitely won't be able to escape. Although the cavalry seems to have returned, they secretly left a few scouts behind. I guess they are deliberately trying to make you lower your guard. That general is either resting on the official road waiting for someone or he has personally dispatched a large group of cavalry to kill you." LV Sichu had actually been secretly sizing up the man and the little girl, but could not see the depth of their thoughts. The purple-shirt woman seemed to be heartless as she smiled and said, "Then what do we do?" The green-robed man also smiled and said, "Ah? Miss, you are wearing a purple robe. Aren't you the head of the Huishan Alliance? Dealing with these rascals, isn't it just a matter of flicking a finger?" Chapter 2053. The woman in the purple dress laughed and gave him a thumbs up. "Good taste." Lu Guanshan was not in a good mood. He had an inexplicable natural hostility towards the strange man in the green robe. Especially when the two of them looked at each other intentionally or unintentionally. Just now Lu Guanshan felt his scalp tingle. The maid who was sitting quietly behind the woman in the purple dress took a deep breath and suddenly said to the man in the green robe, "Sir, I'll go west with you. The others will continue north." The woman's expression was complicated. She wanted to say something but stopped. LV Sichu and the woman in the purple dress were confused. Lu Guanshan blurted out, "Zhou." What was even more strange was that the man in the green robe shook his head and said, "Even if I take someone with me, I'll take the child with the injured arm." The aura of the seemingly old coachman suddenly changed. His eyes were sharp and he stopped tying the young man to himself. He stared at the uninvited guest who spoke with deep meaning. For a moment the rice field was dead silent. The man in the green robe said helplessly, "If I had bad intentions, this wouldn't be the situation now." Obviously, the old coachman and the disciple of the great sword hall Lu Guanshan didn't believe it. Even if the man and the child could successfully pass through the cavalry. The man said softly, "Wang Xing, open the box." The swordswoman nodded. Without any movement, the top board of the long purple box on her back slid open. At that moment the box was filled with the sound of swords. LV Sichu suddenly felt like she was facing a great enemy. She was stunned and said, "How is this possible?" The old coachman couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. He whispered, "Innate sword embryo?" Chapter 8. To read more chapters, you can follow my WeChat account. Fenghua 1985. After the girl saw the look in her master's eyes, she quickly closed the sword box and went silent again. The master and disciple were Su Fengyan and Wang Xing. In fact, it wasn't a coincidence. Su Fengyan did want to save someone. It wasn't the girl from the Guanhai Su family, but the boy who changed his surname. In the early years of the Xiangfu period, the boy's surname should have been Sunday. His grandfather was the Grand Preceptor of West Chu Sun Shiji. At the end of West Chu's restoration, the official Chao Chongqing died outside Tai and city. The Empress Jiang Si died on the battlefield of the Western Wall. Sun Shiji, who had died in the imperial court of West Chu, was a family full of loyal soldiers. The generals all died on the battlefield without exception. The civil officials all died in a heroic manner. However, only the young boy disappeared in the Sea of Fire in the Sun family. Back then, the emperor of Liang, Zhao Xuan, had no intention of investigating this matter and had Zhao Go give up. Later, the new emperor Zhao Zhu admired the Sun family and regretted it. He hoped to secretly find the only remaining child of the Sun family and use it to appease and attract more scholars in Guangling. However, after a thorough investigation, he found that the boy seemed to be involved in a great secret. Thus, Zhao Go of Liang and the Ministry of Justice of the capital had no choice but to take this matter seriously. Su Fengyan only found out about this when he drank with an old spy from the Fu Shui house who had taken root in Jianzhou. In fact, if not for the fact that the Su family of Guanhai came out with the Rouge Beauty Appraiser and attracted too much attention, it was very likely that Zhao Go and the Ministry of Justice would have already found some clues. The boy would probably have grown up safely as a descendant of the Su family and died in bed with that secret. Of course, Su Fengyan didn't know why the Su family of Guanhai wanted the boy to follow Su Baozhao. In fact, the safest plan was for him to stay in the mansion. No matter how bold Song Li and Marquis Gao Tinghui were, they wouldn't dare to lead an army to slaughter the Su family of Guanhai. Did they think that with the help of the old coachman and those Jianghu heroes, it would be enough to deal with Marquis Gao Tinghui's elite cavalry? Or was it because they were worried that the family would be exterminated by Xin Liang for covering up the crime, so they simply threw the boy out of the house and let him die in an unexpected disaster? Su Fengyan didn't care about this. He only wanted to save the boy's life. Otherwise, the Marquis Gao Tinghui, who was in the dark, would most likely not let go of this insignificant scholar of the Su family. However, Su Fengyan had a headache as to what to do with the boy after saving him. He definitely couldn't keep him by his side, so who to hand him to was a big problem. Logically speaking, it would be best to send him to Beiliang and hand him to Xiexibian, but it was a long journey. After all, he had to go from the southeast to the northwest, which almost crossed the entire central plains. The current Su Fengyan was really afraid of trouble. Out of the corner of his eye, Su Fengyan caught a glimpse of Big Sword Hall's Lu Guanshan, who was in a hurry and was afraid that everything would be in vain. He looked at the servant girl and the woman. We both know. Since you have made your choice, then follow me to the west. Don't worry, I will help you settle down in a place where you won't have to worry about anything. Lu Guanshan said in a low voice. We don't even know your surname. How can we trust you? Life and death are not child's play. Su Fengnian smiled and said, Didn't I tell you before? I was from the same family as that sister-in-law 500 years ago. Have you forgotten? Then everyone saw that the man in the green robe smiled at the little girl sitting in front of LVC2 for some reason. He smiled gently and said, Little girl, don't be afraid. Uncle will let your sister protect you later. The little girl blinked her eyes and was a little confused. Su Fengnian said to Wang Xing, You protect them until they reach the Martial Emperor City, then come to Mount Hui. Forget it, go directly to the Earth Lung Mountain to find me. Wang Xing looked at the servant girl who got off the horse and then turned to look at his master. His eyes were a little complicated. Su Fengnian tipped him a chestnut and laughed angrily. What nonsense are you thinking? Wang Xing snorted and jumped onto a red horse without a master. He came to the side of those people and said in a cold voice, Let's go. Su Fengnian suddenly slapped his forehead with a look of realization and relief. He shouted to Wang Xing, Wait, master will switch places with you. You take the girl to the west and do whatever you want along the way. In this way, master can slack off and accompany them to the border of the Sword Province. That will be enough. Wang Xing's eyes lit up and he was a little happy. However, at this moment the servant girl who was walking towards Su Fengnian shook her head and said, I will only follow you. Su Fengnian explained patiently, Although my disciple is young, she is indeed a master. She will never leave you behind. The girl with dark skin and ordinary appearance still shook her head and said, But I am not. I don't want to die. Su Fengnian was stunned. For the first time he realized that this young girl was not as simple as he thought. In fact, she had hit the nail on the head. Su Fengnian did not care about her life or death. Wang Xing took her to the west to attract attention. Later, when Marquis Gao Tingho and even Song Li surrounded them, Wang Xing could naturally advance and retreat freely. As for her fate, Su Fengnian did not care. Life and death were ruled by fate. Wealth and honor were in the hands of the heavens. This had always been Su Fengnian's motto in Jianghu. Su Fengnian did not say anything and Wang Xing did not urge his master. Su Fengnian looked at the girl wearing a mask and suddenly sighed. He thought of the pair of siblings Murong Wuzhu and Murong Tonghuang. They had met for the first time in the Sword Province of the Guangling Path. At that time they were chased by that mad dog Yuan Tingshan, in order to avoid becoming the cauldrons of the ancestor of Mount Hui Shenyuan Pan. Su Fengnian said indifferently, I will send you to the great snow plateau of Mount Hui. The girl said decisively, Okay. It's a deal. Su Fengnian said to Wang Xing, Do you want me to give you a small box to take with you on the way? The girl's swordsman shook her head and said, Master, you should take it with you. It's more convenient for you to deceive mistress. Su Fengnian became angry out of humiliation. He waved his sleeve and said, Impudent. The girl and the woman whispered to each other for a while. Under the curious gazes of LV Chu and the purple-dressed woman, as well as Lu Guanshan's jealous and resentful eyes, the two sides parted. Su Fengnian brought the girl to the extinguished bonfire and then sat down cross-legged to rekindle the fire. There was a shriveled long cloth bag by his feet. The girl held a horse in each hand. She lowered her head to look at the man and asked, Are we still not moving? Su Fengnian fiddled with the bonfire and continued to roast the mostly golden hare. Previously, Marquis Gao Tinghuang's lance had no effect on it. Su Fengnian said casually, Let's fill our stomachs first. The girl's eyes were gloomy, but she didn't say anything in the end. Su Fengnian tore off a hare's leg and handed it to the girl who was still unwilling to sit down. He looked up and said, The nearby towns have all banned night. We'll definitely have to sleep in the open. I'm not hungry. What about you? The girl hesitated for a moment. She let go of the reins and sat down beside him. They were separated by a distance of 2 arms, so both of them had to bend down before she could take the fragrant hare's leg. Then she leaned sideways and gently bit into it. Su Fengnian laughed it off. He tore off a piece of golden and greasy hare meat and chewed slowly. After the two of them finished eating the hare, Su Fengnian clapped his hands and asked curiously, How dare you go with me? The girl asked in return, How dare I not go with you? Su Fengyan smiled and shook his head. It's not good for a woman to be too smart. The girl's eyes were gloomy. She raised her hand and wiped the corner of her mouth without saying a word. Su Fengyan slanted his cloth bag and slowly got up. Let's go when you're full. The girl quickly got up and walked quickly to a horse. Then she immediately became uneasy because she realized that she didn't know how to ride a horse at all. Su Fengyan was amused. He walked to her side and gently pressed his hand on her shoulder. The girl quickly lowered her waist and retreated. Then she quickly pulled out a dagger that was originally tied to her sleeve and held it tightly with both hands. She stared at the man in the green robe with unwavering determination in her eyes. Su Fengyan said unhappily, I don't care what you look like under your skin. Anyway, I've never seen it and I don't plan to see it in the future. Just look at your current appearance. Do you need me to give you a mirror? Chapter 2054. The girl's ears were red, but she was still unwilling to put down the dagger. Her watery eyes, which were completely different from her calm appearance, were filled with disdain and contempt. Su Fengyan, who was regarded as a lecher, stood in place and pushed away the sword that was stabbing towards his forehead with 2 fingers. It turned out that LV Sichu had returned and swiftly stabbed with his sword. Wang Xing stopped his horse in the distance and did not stop LV Sichu's attack. The girl just rolled her eyes. LV Sichu did not attack a second time. It was not that he did not want to, but he could not because his entire arm had lost feeling. Su Fengyan glanced at the young man. During my 2nd year in Xiangfu, I once fought with your grandfather LV Dantian. After saying this, Su Fengyan took a step forward and grabbed the girl's shoulder. The 2 of them instantly disappeared. LV Sichu was dumbfounded as if he was struck by lightning. Dozens of miles away on a narrow path, a dizzy young girl bent over and kept retching. Su Fengyan said hello and returned the dagger that had fallen out of her hand to her. The girl trembled as she took the dagger and put it back into the sheath. Her watery eyes were wide open. They were filled with confusion, shock, curiosity, and so on. Su Fengyan smiled and asked, Have you recovered? The girl subconsciously nodded. The next time they stopped, the girl sat on the ground. A moment later, when Su Fengyan asked the same question again, the girl gritted her teeth and nodded. After the 3rd time, the girl was about to cry. She did not wait for Su Fengyan to say anything and shook her head vigorously. Then the 2 of them sat and stood by the stream in the mountains. Su Fengyan smiled and didn't immediately take her on their journey. The girl took a deep breath and squatted by the stream. She scooped a handful of water to wash her face and then fell into a daze. Su Fengyan reminded her, Your face is not good enough. Be careful when you wash your face next time. The girl turned her head and asked, Can I ask who you are? Su Fengyan nodded and said, Of course. The girl quietly waited for him to continue. Su Fengyan continued, But I won't say it. The girl was speechless. The girl thought for a moment. I'm that Su Baozhao. Su Fengyan smiled and said, My surname is also Su. The girl smiled for the first time. If I take off this mask, can you tell me who you are? Su Fengyan asked, If I take off my clothes, will you take them off? The girl was once again left speechless. Su Fengyan squatted down and pulled out a blade of grass that grew between the cracks of the rocks. He put it in his mouth and chewed it gently. The girl looked at him from the side, not knowing what she was thinking. #### extra chapter 9. More updates have been uploaded on WeChat. You can read them. WeChat ID, Fenghua 1985. Overnight, the 2 of them arrived at the riverside crossing of the Xi River. They could already see the silhouette of Mount Hui and Mount Longhu in the distance. If it wasn't for the fact that they had to take care of the girl, they wouldn't even need to wait for dawn to arrive. The 2 of them waited at the crossing for a huge 2-story ferry to set sail. Mount Hui was now the holy land of Jianghu. Watching the snow on the snowy plains was also one of the top 10 sights of Liyang. Every day there would be an endless stream of people going to Mount Hui to enjoy the scenery. There were many ferries on the Xi River that went directly to the foot of Mount Hui. If you wanted to board a ferry, you would have to fork out 1 tael of silver. Of course, it was also possible to go to Mount Huishan by land, but you would miss the view of the moonless tower overlooking the river. Ever since someone said that he had seen the peerless figure of the purple dress of Mount Huishan on the top of the building on the ferry business had been booming. After all, it was true that anyone could climb up Mount Huishan, but not everyone could climb up the snow plateau on the Bull Mount. There was still less than an hour before they set off. Su Fengnian and the girl from the Guanhai Su family were sitting at a porridge shop at the crossing. They were surrounded by a group of burly men who looked like bandits. When some of them caught a glimpse of Su Baozao's back, their blood rushed to their heads. That slender waist and tight buttocks of hers were attractive enough. If they could change that coarse cloth skirt into silk and satin, just her swollen buttocks would be enough to take their lives. However, when those men excitedly found a chance to see the girl's face, they quickly returned to their original positions while cursing. It was very disappointing. Su Baozao was originally indifferent. However, when she noticed that the corner of the guy's mouth was slightly raised, she was in a bad mood. She sneered and stuck out a finger to her temple as if she was going to tear off her face. Su Fengnian said flatly, "You have to bear the consequences." Su Baozao resentfully put down her finger. "Who are you going to give me to?" Su Fengnian didn't hide anything and said bluntly, "It's not a certain person. To be precise, it's Mount Hui. In short, you will be very safe. Even the one surnamed Song won't dare to touch you." Su Baozao's face was cold. "Other than handing me to that girl in Mount Hui, are the others any different from the one surnamed Song? I'm afraid they're not as powerful as Song Li." Su Fengnian rubbed his chin and then asked seriously, "I forgot to ask you what you think. If it's to lure away Marquis Gauding's cavalry, it's already done. As for that boy's safety with my disciple there shouldn't be any big changes. The reason why I wanted to take you to Mount Hui from the beginning was because I thought you were someone from the past. You can tell me now. It's not too late to change your mind. Moreover, I don't want to owe Mount Hui a favor for nothing." Su Baozao was silent. Su Fengnian continued, "Although I don't find Song Li pleasing to the eye in the eyes of many women, he might be a rare good match. He's good at both civil and martial arts and started from scratch. Yu's age isn't too old, but his official title is high enough. He's already a general with the surname Ping, and also a deputy provincial governor." Su Baozao suddenly said, "Between a man and a woman, isn't there a need for love at first sight and mutual affection?" Su Fengnian smiled. "Do you want me to throw you in front of Song Li? That won't do. I'm afraid I won't be able to hold back." Su Fengnian didn't continue. He was really afraid that he would kill Song Li because his hands were itchy. Then the deputy provincial governor of Guangling would have to be replaced. The kanji shop's waiter had already urged the two of them to quickly pay up and get out of here. Don't occupy the latrine and delay them from making money. Su Baozao looked at the man in green who obediently took out his copper coins to pay the bill and felt a little strange. She had also secretly read some scholars and beautiful women, ghost stories and romance novels in her boudoir. As a young girl who had almost never stepped out of the Su family's house in Guanhai, she didn't have any longing or admiration for the kind of people in Jianghu who would pull out a sword to help others when they saw injustice. However, she was still somewhat envious of their chivalry. She felt that she was a sparrow in a cage who could only eat the bait fed by others day after day. Therefore, as for those who could live and die on their own, besides being envious, she was also somewhat jealous. After Su Baozao was 10 years old, she didn't even have the opportunity to go out to the temple to burn incense. Su Fengnian weighed the copper coins in his hands and caught a glimpse of a hawker not far away selling 2 large baskets of persimmons. The bright yellow color was very pleasing. He ran over to bargain and bought 2 caddies of persimmons. He put them all in his robe and then squatted at the edge of the ferry. He casually tossed 1 persimmon to Su Baozao, who was standing beside him. Su Baozao used her sleeve to carefully wipe the persimmon before taking small bites. She didn't forget to raise a hand to cover her mouth. The persimmon was indeed ripe, but there was still some astringent aftertaste. Su Fengnian took a big bite of the persimmon and smiled vaguely. "I've eaten persimmons from many places. Beiliang's Longshi's chicken heart yellow persimmon, the capital's persimmon Yuezhou's lotus persimmon, and the southern Jianzhou's persimmon. However, the taste is not as good as an unknown wild persimmon from Gangnam-do in the early years. It's a small red color, especially bright red. It's delicious." Su Baozao seriously reminded him, "Your table manners are really ugly." Su Fengnian ate 1 persimmon after another. Soon the only persimmons left in his pocket were a pair of fellow sufferers. He then stopped eating like a hungry ghost and looked into the distance. Unknowingly, old Huang, who lacked front teeth, had passed away for more than 10 years. Su Baozao suddenly couldn't help but squat down. Then she felt a gentle breeze above her head. She turned her head to look and saw a shifty-eyed man resentfully retract his hand. It was obvious that he had been aiming for the round and perky part of her waist. She glared at him angrily. The short and vigorous man with a short saber in a golden sheath grinned and made a kneading gesture with his hand provocatively. Su Baozhao was helpless. She could only turn her head to Su Fengnian and say angrily, "You're turning a blind eye?" Su Fengnian sat cross-legged with his hands on his knees. He squinted his eyes and smiled. 10 years ago I wouldn't be any better than him. Su Baozhao fiercely threw away half of the persimmon and said angrily, "Pervert." Su Fengnian laughed and said, "It's a waste of youth if one isn't perverted." Su Baozhao stared fiercely at the disappointing man in green. "How can a person like you become a Jianghu master? God must be blind." Su Fengnian nodded indifferently and said, "Yes, yes." Perhaps because they realized that the man beside Su Baozhao didn't even dare to fart. The man with the short golden sheathed knife and the 2 burly men beside him thought that they were 2 soft persimmons. The 3 of them laughed strangely and surrounded the man and woman who were squatting on the ground. One of them crossed his arms and said, "Although this little girl doesn't look good, if you blow out the lights at night or cover her head during the day, as long as you don't look at her charcoal face and take off her clothes, you'll definitely have a different taste. I reckon she's not far from a courtesan, right? Isn't that right, brothers?" The short man sneakily stretched out his toes as if he wanted to weigh the girl's 2 full moons. Chapter 2055. As a result, the 3 of them flew high into the air at the same time and then landed on the surface of the Xi River. After that, they glided over the surface of the river like dragonflies skimming the surface of the water, moving further and further away. Finally, they disappeared from everyone's sight at the ferry at lightning speed. This Qinggong was really amazing. The people of Jianghu at the ferry were very impressed. They thought that it was no wonder that the real person did not reveal his true appearance. When an expert made a move, it was obvious whether they were real or not. If the 3 masters did not let out a series of strange cries, their fluttering demeanor would be even more flawless. Su Fengnian clicked his tongue and said, "Amazing, amazing." The girl who was looking at him in a new light immediately lost her good mood. She sneered and said, "If I didn't know better, I would have thought that it was you and not me. You're wearing an extra layer of skin." For the first time the guy did not talk back. He shrunk his shoulders and folded his hands into his sleeves, squinting his eyes and looking into the distance. He had a martial arts cultivation, but he looked like a vulgar villager who squatted in the field and stared at the harvest. Su Baozhao snorted in disdain. He remembered those scholars in the books. Which one of them wasn't spirited and outstanding? Which one of them wasn't elegant and refined? Which one of them wasn't handsome and elegant? The 2 of them did not speak until the ferry was about to set sail. Su Fengnian called her to walk together. He found that the eyes of the men around them were shining, so he let her step on the wooden plank that connected the ferry and the bow. After she walked up, she suddenly turned to Su Fengnian and stretched out 2 fingers. She gently bent them, indicating that he should watch his eyes. Su Fengnian smiled and nodded. The 2 of them did not enter the cabin. They stood at the stern. Su Fengnian leaned on the railing. She thought for a moment and could not help but ask, "Can your disciple really escort them to the border of Jianzhou smoothly?" Su Fengnian nodded. Su Baozhao asked again, "Your disciple and the young swordsman with a long sword can make the sword in the scabbard vibrate by itself. Are they the kind of sword immortals who can take people's heads from thousands of miles away?" Su Fengnian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. That's still far from it. Over the past 100 years, if we don't count the reincarnation of Ancestor Lu, there are probably only Lu Songtao of Zhulu Mountain, Li Chungang of the Spring and Autumn Sword Armor, and Dong Tai of the Peach Blossom Sword Deity. The current 2nd in the world, Yu Groom, and the 3rd in the world, Cui Hua of the Wu family sword tomb, are still a little lacking. "Oh," Su Baozhao muttered. "Anyway, I've only heard of Wudong Mountain's Ancestor Lu." Su Fengnian laughed and asked, "That Lu Guanshan of yours, didn't he tell you about these Jianghu people and strange things?" Su Baozhao frowned and said, "Young Master Lu is a guest of our Su clan. I have nothing to do with him. I heard from young Master Lu that he only saw me once from afar a few years ago." Su Fengnian asked, "The scholar who broke off 2 marriages?" Su Baozhao snorted coldly. "When I was young, I went to the Taoist temple to burn incense and saw him once. He's just a sanctimonious hypocrite." Su Fengnian shook his head lightly. Lu Guanshan might not be a true hero, but that scholar might not be a hypocrite. Su Baozhao sneered. You even know this? Su Fengyan sighed. You can't say that Lu Guanshan is a bad person. After all, in order to save you, he put his life on the line and even risked angering a deputy provincial governor. Therefore, you can't say that he doesn't like you sincerely. As for that scholar from your hometown who backed out at the last moment, in my opinion, he's really not easy. He can be said to be filial and righteous. You're still young, the kind of love he has for someone will probably only be experienced in the future. Su Baozhao was annoyed. What nonsense are you talking about? Su Fengyan raised his head and looked. At this time, the Shi River where the ferry was located was still some distance away from Mount Hui. It was also because of this that he could see the imposing and majestic bull mound from afar. There were thousands of tall buildings in the world, but it was indeed rare to see a building as tall as the missing moon house in the Great Snow Plateau, especially a building that was 9 stories tall. Probably only the tide-listening pavilion in Mount Qingliang and the star-picking platform in the capital's imperial astronomer could be compared to it. Su Fengyan had a lot of feelings for Mount Hui. This was not only the place where the old man wearing the sheepskin fur coat returned to the land as a sword immortal, it was also the first time he saw the peerless glory of the saints of the 3 sections. Back then, the Confucian sage Xianyuan Jingqing cleaned up the house and shook the ancestor of Mount Hui, Xianyuan Pan. That battle could be said to be extremely magnificent. The scholar's words, "Ancestor, please die." How heroic it was. Su Fengyan leaned on the railing and muttered to himself, "Who said that the scholar has no guts and dares to ask the heaven and earth to sink into the sea?" Xianyuan Jingqing's love is so deep that he and Li Xiaoxin have reached a kind of limit. Su Baozhao pricked up her ears and listened carefully. Her rooting face was really rough. If one paid a little attention, one would find that the color of her face was incompatible with her whole person. The tide-listening pavilion's death warrior Zhou Xian was proficient in this field. She once said that there were 3 levels to making a face, namely the rooting and the enchanting. In order to escape from Bailiang, she had to pay a huge price of 10 years of her life to make an enchanting face and exchange it with Su Fengyan. Only then did she go to the king of Jingyan, Zhao Sun. As for whether she regretted tying her fate to that emperor of 10 years, and finally died for Zhao Sun, Su Fengyan did not know what she was thinking before she died. However, the last time Su Fengyan saw her was before the battle with Chen Jibao on the Guangling River. The woman jumped into the river to save the young king of Zhao who had fallen into the water. At that moment, Su Fengyan felt that Zhu Xiu might have really fallen in love with Zhao Sun, who was lofty and fragile. However, he did not know whether Zhao Sun knew the true identity of the woman beside him before his death, and whether he had seen the true face under the mask. As for the enchanting face, Su Fengyan gave it to Murong Tonghuang. The latter entered Beimang during the Yong Hui auspicious talisman and became the most trusted confidant of the former Beimang crown prince Yelu Hongkai. After the Bailiang cavalry went north to the grassland, Su Fengyan tried to find him but to no avail. Most of the fate in the world was like this. One's thoughts were constantly on one's mind and could never be forgotten. Su Baozhao suddenly asked worriedly, "Aren't you afraid that Marquis Gao Tinghuang will turn around and chase after your disciple?" Su Fengyan explained, "A good qi refinement grandmaster came from Seaview County. When we stopped for the first time, I gave them some clues to keep them in suspense." Su Baozhao's eyes lit up. Qi refinement warrior? Is he one of those celestial beings in books who live in the clouds and drink dew? Su Fengyan smiled and said, "You can think of it that way." Su Baozhao realized that this person's eyes were naturally long and narrow. Every time he smiled, it became more obvious, just like willow leaves in the spring breeze. But she still did not like it. Su Fengyan was indeed very comfortable at this moment. This was because almost all the qi refinement warriors from the former Liang and Beimang dynasties had been killed by him. Now that he had retired from the martial world and looked back at the martial world, he finally had some of the leisure and carefree mood of Dongtai. Naturally, he felt a different kind of feeling in his heart. Su Fengyan straightened up and suddenly looked up. There was a touch of purple on the roof of the moonless tower. It was as if a high and mighty celestial being was overlooking the mortal world. ###extra chapter 10. More updates have been uploaded on the official WeChat account. Everyone can follow and read it. WeChat ID, Fenghua 1985. Su Fengyan was feeling a little complicated. Before the Battle of North City, He had made an appointment with her to find the one guy for a drink one day in the future. He did not know why she seemed to have changed her mind. Previously, Su Fengnian went to the small town to invite her, but the message he sent to the snow plains of Mount Hui was like a clay ox in the sea. For a long time, there were sharp-eyed people in the martial world who saw the strange phenomenon on the peak of Mount Hui. For a moment there was an uproar on the ferry. Even Su Baozhao raised her head and looked at the blurry moonless tower in a daze. Actually, it was absolutely impossible to see the figure clearly. However, even if the tourists on the ferry tried their best to open their eyes, they could only see the silhouette of the tallest building in the world. It was as if they had seen the peerless beauty of Mount Hui with their own eyes. All of them were dazzled and their emotions surged. Perhaps no one would have thought that after Li Chungang and Wang Xianji, the person who could make the martial world bow down to her was actually a woman. The Northwest vassal king who had made a great contribution to the world originally had more hope, but he died. The father conquered the central plains and the son conquered the grasslands. In the end, the two generations of the Su family did not fight for the throne. They did not usurp the throne and become the emperor. Su Baozhao, whose eyes were sore, wanted to withdraw her gaze. At this moment all the passengers on the ferry were stunned. They could clearly see a purple rainbow rising from the top of the snow plains and then rapidly falling into the river at the foot of the mountain. Wait a minute, could it be their ferry? Mount Hui's purple dress crashed onto the bow of the ferry. Chapter 2056. The bow of the ferry sank deep into the river and the stern of the ferry rose up high. The entire ferry tilted to a huge angle. People and horses were thrown off their feet and it was a complete mess. The tourists in the cabins were still fine. They were just piled up like dumplings at the bow of the ferry. However, the passengers who were enjoying the scenery on the deck were in trouble. They all fell into the Xi River like dumplings. Su Fengnian's feet were rooted to the ground and he didn't move at all. Su Baozhao closed her eyes in a panic. When she opened her eyes in the next moment, she found that she was firmly rooted to a slope and hadn't fallen to the ground. The stern of the ferry landed heavily on the surface of the river, creating a huge splash. The imposing and insufferably arrogant Mount Huizi casually waved her sleeves, and those who had fallen into the Xi River were all pulled back to the ferry. They fell onto the deck of the ferry and all of them were in a daze. Xianyuan Qingfeng, who had almost stepped on the ferry and overturned it, glanced at Su Fengnian. There was some doubt and inquiry in her eyes. Su Fengnian responded with a wry smile. She snorted coldly and suddenly disappeared. Su Baozhao's mind was sharp. She went straight to the point and asked, "Do you know the Jianghu leader of Mount Hui?" Su Fengnian couldn't help laughing. He asked with a smile, "You don't know her? Who doesn't know her?" Su Baozhao asked again, "She knows you too?" Su Fengnian didn't try to hide it. He leaned on the railing again. "I knew her a long time ago. At that time the Jianghu people didn't know us. At that time, Yujian province probably only heard of a prodigal woman surnamed Xianyuan in Mount Hui. Her slingshot was made of gold." Su Baozhao's eyes were absent-minded. She lowered her voice and asked, "Who are you? Are you the peach blossom sword god?" Su Fengnian was stunned. He thought that this girl's thoughts were very imaginative. How could she link him to Dong Tai? Su Baozhao stared at Su Fengnian and said, "Grandpa Song and Lu Guanshan have told me some things about Jianghu. In particular, Grandpa Song, as a Grand Master of swordsmanship, admired the peach blossom sword god who went to the sea to visit immortals the most. He said that Mr. Deng's swordsmanship had already reached perfection, and his attainment in swordsmanship was no less than that of the great immortal Lu Dongxian. Grandpa Song also said that Dong Tai did not like carrying a sword. Since you even know the leader of the Shenyuan alliance, coupled with your indifferent attitude towards Marquis Gao Tingho and the other military officials, and your appearance." Su Fengnian interrupted the woman's speculation and said angrily, "Just because I'm ugly I'm Dong Tai? Then if I'm handsome won't I be the king of Bailiang, Su Fengnian?" Su Baozhao said bluntly, "Then you'll have to be reincarnated into a good body in your next life to have the chance to be the Su Fengnian of Jianghu for 100 years. Su Fengnian smiled knowingly. "Since I've known you, this is the most reasonable sentence you've ever said." Su Baozhao twitched the corner of her mouth and gave a cold smile. Su Fengnian asked for no reason, "Did you like Taoist classics in the past? Do you want to learn martial arts in the future?" Su Baozhao was confused. She did not know what this mysterious man wanted to do. She was not in a hurry to answer. She only glanced at Su Fengnian from the corner of her eyes. Su Fengnian's expression was serious. Do you know that you're a person with fate? Su Baozhao was angry for no reason. She sneered and said, Fate? Of course I have it. Otherwise how could I be ranked fourth? The second evaluation also said that in the next Rouge evaluation in 5 or 10 years, when the youngest daughter of the Su family grows up, she will definitely be ranked in the top 3. She even has a chance to win the title of the world's #1 color. Do you think I have fate or not? Su Fengnian sighed softly and said, There have been so many Rouge evaluations, but I don't think there has ever been an evaluation of the world's #1 color. Only the last Empress of West Chu won the title of the world's #1 color, and became one of the 13 colors of spring and autumn. I'm not interested in the world's #1 color. I've only heard of the Bailiang cavalry. Su Baozhao frowned. The Bailiang cavalry? Didn't they break up? Su Fengnian raised his head. The river breeze brushed past his face, blowing his sideburns as if he was flipping through a book. He whispered, Yes. Back then at the northwest gate of the Central Plains, it was said that Bailiang had 300,000 iron cavalry. Of course, it was impossible for the real Northwest cavalry to have 300,000. At its peak it was only 140,000. At the end of the 3rd year of Xiangfu, it was getting worse and worse. After the 30,000 left cavalry led by Lu Dian was destroyed, Yu Wandao's Yuzhou cavalry, Yuan Tingshan's White Feather Light cavalry, Su Longxiang and Li Mofen's Dragon Elephant cavalry, Ko Jianghuai's Liuzhou cavalry at Chifu Long Pass, Ningamei's Iron Stupa, and many of the Bailiang cavalry's main field battle forces. In addition to the 2 heavy cavalry armies, they lost and replenished their sources of soldiers again and again. In the end most of them were still not organized. Before the young king left the Bailiang frontier army, only the Great Snow Dragon cavalry maintained a relatively complete organization. The new Liang dynasty also had some considerations or apprehensions, so they did not make a move on this famous cavalry army. They let Xie Shibian, who was unwilling to enter the capital to be an official or general, command this army and intimidate the grassland. As for why they chose Xie Shibian, who had only joined the Bailiang frontier army much later, instead of Bailiang's native generals like Li Yanchao, Ningamei, and Li Mofen, the imperial court's intentions were obvious. The frightened people on the ferry weren't angry at all. Instead they felt flattered and honored. They felt as if they had been struck by a pie in the sky. That's right. Shenyuanzi had disappeared from the Jianghu for many years. Today, a deity had descended to the mortal world for no reason. How could these small fries not feel extremely lucky? After Su Fengnian brought Su Baozhao ashore, they didn't climb the mountain. Instead they went straight to Mount Longhu. He explained to her, I don't think Mount Hui will accept you. I'll think of something else. Originally it would have been best for you to stay at Mount Hui. The only places in the world where you don't have to give in to the government are these 2 mountains. Mount Hui and Mount Wudong. The latter is too far away from your hometown. Su Baozhao laughed heartily. It looks like you're definitely not that peach blossom sword god. Otherwise, no matter how arrogant the Shenyuan Alliance's leader is, he would still give you face. Su Fengnian glanced at her. Shouldn't you be more worried about your own situation? Su Baozhao put her hands behind her back. Her footsteps were light as she stepped on the bluestone path. She didn't look like a stray dog that was fleeing for her life. Instead she looked like a carefree child who was enjoying the autumn scenery. She smiled. Even if the sky falls, there's someone tall to hold it up. What's there to be afraid of? Su Fengnian teased, You're quite carefree. Su Baozhao had yet to leave the territory of the Shenyuan family in Mount Hui, so it was still quite lively. Su Baozhao caught a glimpse of old peddlers on the side of the road. They were yelling with all their might to sell sticks of freshly dipped sugar-coated haws. A few gluttonous children begged their parents and elders for copper coins and ran off to buy them. There was also a beautiful woman with a cold, fairy-like face standing not far away. A young hero had already bought a stick of sugar-coated haws with golden syrup. The woman took it and smiled sweetly, melting the young hero's heart. Su Baozhao didn't stand on ceremony with Su Fengnian. She stretched out a hand and gestured for him to take out the money. Su Fengnian was too lazy to argue with her. He took off the long cloth bag slung over his shoulder and took out a piece of broken silver for her. Su Baozhao asked, Don't you have some copper coins? Nowadays silver is very expensive and copper is very cheap. Be careful that the peddlers don't have enough copper coins. Su Fengnian smiled softly and said, I have to save up copper coins for others. Su Baozhao couldn't figure it out, but she didn't think about it. She took the silver and went to buy the sugar-coated haws. She was quite generous and bought 2 sticks. She gave one to Su Fengnian. It wasn't that the peddler thought she was rich and easy to fool, but in Mount Hui, killing pigs was a natural thing to do. The price of a bowl of wine could buy a jar of wine anywhere else. My WeChat public account. Fenghua 1985. Su Baozhao held the stick of sugar-coated haws and smiled. Her pair of lively eyebrows were like crescent moons. She slowly licked the sugar-coated haws and a trace of happiness appeared on her face. She was content with what she had, so the sourness was at the tip of her tongue and the sweetness was at the bottom of her heart. Perhaps he was infected by her sudden happiness. Su Fengnian chewed on the sugar-coated haws and smiled. Su Baozhao said to herself, I used to hear from the maids at home that you could eat this kind of stuff when you go to the temple fair or the Daoist temple in autumn. Especially the sugar-coated haws from Xianxia are the most delicious. They are not strung together with bamboo sticks, but placed in exquisite and beautiful paper boxes. They are said to make people drool just by looking at them. Su Fengnian asked, Is this your first time tasting something new? Su Baozhao curled her lips, yes. She seemed to be afraid that Su Fengnian would look down on her, so she quickly added proudly, Although I have never eaten sugar-coated haws, I have tasted Luling's winter bamboo shoots, Guangling's wild ferns, Anshi's lychees, Yonggan's oranges, Yicheng's chestnuts, Hain's pomegranates, Shangyuan's alligator, Songjiang's perch jujube cakes, Nuohong, Wuzhou's slender-waist japonica rice, and even Bailiang's green ant wine. What about you? Have you eaten it before? Su Fengnian laughed it off. It turned out that she was a silly girl who liked to compete with others.